So I've mentioned before that radiation can be harmful to biological organisms. Now let's start to talk about exactly how and quantitatively how much. First, we'll talk about the short-term effects of exposure to a large amount of radiation. Then we'll talk about the long-term effects of exposure to a small amount of radiation. Because there really are no short-term effects from a little bit of radiation, and if you get a huge amount of radiation, there are more pressing concerns than the long-term effects. There's a few levels of radiation exposure that are important to talk about in terms of short-term effects. Below about 1/4 of a gray, or 1/4 of a joule per exposed kilogram of mass, there's pretty much no short-term effects from radiation. Now that's a rather high dose, so that will have some long-term effects, but the short-term effects are pretty much negligible. Once you get to the range of about 1 gray, sensitive people will start seeing some effects. You might start seeing things like decreased blood cell count, a little bit of gastrointestinal problem for sensitive people, and then 1 to 3 gray, things start getting bad for the general population, where without some sort of supportive care, you become at risk of dying from radiation exposure. 3 to 6 gray is you definitely need supportive care, and you'll start to experience things like gastrointestinal syndrome, which I'll explain later. And then more than about 6 gray, you're toast. That's a large amount of radiation exposure to get at once. But the number of times that's actually happened in all of history is very, very small. Something I'll talk about a little later is how do we know this dose versus effects correlation. We have some pretty good data for short-term effects of a lot of radiation, because it only takes observing 1 or 2 people to see what happens. But when it comes later to looking at the long-term effects of a small amount of radiation, luckily we don't have enough data to be fully sure. And I say luckily because that means that throughout history, relatively few people have been exposed to non-negligible amounts of radiation. There are 4 main phases of acute radiation poisoning. The first is what's called the prodromal phase, where you get the initial symptoms of exposure, let's say 1 to 3 days after exposure, or sooner if the exposure is really, really large. Now there's going to be a lot of patterns that I'll highlight in these data coming up. One of them is that the higher your radiation dose, the shorter your prodromal phase. Actually, the shorter all of these phases are going to be because they just progress more quickly. Then there'll be a latent phase where it looks like things are actually okay. You might have been exposed to a large amount of radiation, and then after a day or 2 it looks like you've recovered, but there are some longer-term effects that take weeks to days to manifest that will then come in what's called the manifest illness phase, when you find out how well you're really doing. Because let's say that radiation kills a lot of stem cells in your body, things like dividing skin cells or cells in your intestines, in your colon, that it's going to take 2 or 3 weeks before those cells cease to divide and that organ stops functioning as it should. And then there's the final phase, which takes one of 2 forms, either recovery or not. And that can take months to years to recover, depending on how extreme the exposure to radiation was. There's a lot here on the slide in terms of the symptoms of acute radiation exposure, but I'll walk you through one line at a time so you can see what's there and you can start to see the patterns between how much dose you get and how severe the effects are. Let's start at the top with vomiting. So you may have heard that a large amount of radiation exposure can cause vomiting. The exact reason for which is not fully understood. We have some details of the pathways and mechanisms, but it's not complete. What I do want you to notice, though, is the more radiation dose you get, the quicker and the more severe the vomiting onsets. And that should be fairly obvious because whatever radiation triggers in the body to cause vomiting, more radiation causes more trigger and makes that happen a lot sooner. Same thing goes for the onset of diarrhea. If your body relies on the villi and the stem cells in your intestines to absorb moisture and absorb nutrients, if you kill off those cells, you suddenly lose the ability to process moisture and your body just says, yep, everything out of there. And the more dose you get, the higher the probability that you'll suffer symptoms of diarrhea. Things like headache can occur as well, where there'll be some immediate change in neurological function which manifests itself as a mild to severe headache. The less the dose, the less likely you get a headache at all, and also the less the dose, the less severe any headache will be. So it ranges from no headache all the way to severe for really, really high levels of radiation. Same thing goes for loss of consciousness. even at the medium doses, let's say single gray, usually don't pass out. But we know from a very few encounters with very high levels of radiation that a high dose can actually cause unconsciousness because it causes immediate lack of function in the neurons, which are brain and spinal cord, which can cause unconsciousness. And finally, you can see that a fever often comes with acute radiation exposure. This would be an increase in body temperature due to all of your body's repair mechanisms and cell death ramping up like crazy to deal with the damage that radiation has just incurred. At low levels, you don't tend to observe a fever, and at higher levels of radiation, the fever will be more severe, last longer, and more likely to occur. Now let's talk about the latent phase of radiation exposure, where it looks like everything's going okay. It's really not, if you've gotten, let's say, above a gray of radiation dose. This can often be monitored. Even though it can't be seen symptomatically, it can be monitored by looking at blood levels, things like leukocytes, platelets, and other macrophages and other cells which are always dividing in the body. The thing to note here is that cells in the body have a finite lifetime, and you rely on things like bone marrow to produce those cells. And if those cells aren't created or don't divide as quickly as they used to, you'll see a drop in their concentration in, let's say, number per deciliter or something like that. Notice also that the latent phase tends to last shorter for a higher radiation exposure. This is because the sudden damage is more severe, and if the cells have died off more quickly and the repair mechanisms have been damaged more severely, then all of a sudden you could be left with a lack of platelets and you might have temporary hemophilia. You could be left with a lack of leukocytes, macrophages, or other helpful cells that kill infection, and you're suddenly susceptible to sepsis or some sudden infection. It can cause leaks all around your blood vessels, leading to edema or fluid filling in the tissues. Finally, moving on to things like the critical phase, which is whatever's going to happen is going to happen. For really low levels of radiation, you can see that it takes a while to occur, recovery is fairly quick, and the chance of death is very low. As you increase higher and higher, the chance of death increases, and this counts whether or not you have supportive care. In other words, if your white blood cells have been wiped out, you'd better be in a hospital and have a transfusion of blood plasma where you can get external white blood cells, while your bone marrow slowly recovers and builds up its ability again to regenerate those cells. There's a lot of information on this slide, which I say you can go through on your own time, but I do want to explain a few of the terms that you see here just to explain what you're seeing. Whenever you see depilation, that refers to hair loss. You may have heard that acute radiation exposure can cause hair loss. Again, this is because the hair follicles are continuously producing hair and growing, and if they get killed or their resources get cut off, the hair gets thinner and thinner until it simply ceases to grow or falls out. You might see something called leukopenia, which is a reduced white blood cell count, and this would correspond to how well your body can resist infection from the normal routes of exposure that we're exposed to every day. Radiation damage really heightens the body's sensitivity to infection because it kills off the cells and the marrow that produces the cells, which help us fight off infection. You may also see a rather long one called thrombocytopenia, which is fancy words for a reduced platelet count. This has to do with how well your body can clot in the event that a blood vessel is broken. And this is why I mentioned those little leaks that can happen everywhere in your blood vessels. Normally, platelets would exude compounds that would patch up those holes. But if radiation damage causes those platelet levels to go down, then you don't have the ability, and you're kind of a temporary hemophiliac. And finally, there's hypotension or abnormally low blood pressure. Your body relies on maintaining a certain range of blood pressure, and if your blood vessels become leaky, because there's fluid or blood leaking out even in small amounts, your body has to work extra hard to keep the blood pressure high enough to continue supplying oxygen to the brain and tissues. That means your heart's going to have to pump harder, and if your blood pressure gets too low, you can pass out. If it gets critically low, your tissues and brain cease to get enough oxygen, and that can be the cause of death.